Okay, we are going to start our discussion on carbohydrates. I am sure that you guys have discussed carbohydrates in other classes, such as biology or maybe your foods and nutrition classes for nursing. So some of this should be a review. It's a major source of energy in our diet, along with proteins and fats. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are the main components. Now, if we break down the word carbohydrates, the first half is carbo, referring to carbon. The second part is hydrate. Now, you may remember the word hydrate as in hydrated, which means water. You're adding water, or if you're dehydrated, you're subtracting water. Well, carbohydrates are carbon and water, and that shows you what three elements are in there. In fact, most of the breakdown of it would be CN, water, N, which means for every 3 carbons, for instance, there are 3 sets of water, which means the chemical formula would be C3H6O3, because everything inside the parentheses gets multiplied by 3. However many carbons there are, how many waters you'll have. And that's where we get the term carbohydrates. The term saccharide means sugar. And you'll see that word come up quite often. Carbohydrates are produced from photosynthesis, which I'm sure you've learned in biology, where the trees take carbon dioxide and water, and with the energy from the sun, they produce the carbohydrates. And then we take in oxygen with respiration, and we break it down again, and it's a cycle. When we look at carbohydrates, we're referring to saccharides, and we just learned that saccharide means sugar. If we take the first part of these words, mono, di, and tri, we find mono is 1, di is 2, poly is many. So that means 1 sugar, 2 sugars, many sugars, which is why we have those. The simplest carbohydrate is only 1 sugar large. For instance, here's a monosaccharide. If we try to break it down, we still only have 1 at the end. Whereas if we have a disaccharide, we can break it down into 2. And then we have a poly, meaning many, we can break it down into the individuals. And you'll have several of them when they're done. Alright, so this should look familiar from the last chapter when we were talking about Fisher projections. Notice that the double bond is always the furthest up. That was done deliberately, because the most oxidized one will be on the top. Monosaccharides contain 3 to 8 carbons. For instance, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. Now, if it's an aldehyde, meaning the double bond is on the top, it's an aldose. If it's a ketone, meaning double bond is somewhere in the middle, it's a ketose. So it's all depending on where that double bonded oxygen is. And that's just another way of classifying the carbons, or classifying the saccharides. You'll also notice that they all have OH groups on them as well. All the remainders have OH groups. Now, once again, if we take the abbreviation or the equation to figure out the chemical formula, for every carbon, there's a water molecule. Well, here's a carbon, OH and H, so we have 2 hydrogens and an oxygen here. That means for that carbon, we have H2O. And you'll notice here's a carbon, OH and H. H2O for that carbon. Here's another carbon, H, OH, H2O for that carbon. You see the trend. Now with monosaccharides, to label what kind of saccharide they are, they count how many carbons there are, just like we do with the chains. But notice these aren't necessarily the same. The bottom two are. The top, triose and tetrose, are not the same as the usual naming for IUPAC that we're used to. But see, 1, 2, 3 is a triose. It's also an aldehyde because the double bond is on top. So it's an aldo triose. 3 carbons for triose. Os meaning it's a sugar. Aldo because it's an aldehyde. If we look at the last one, it's a ketone. So notice it starts with keto rather than aldo. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons here. So it's hexose. So it's ketohexose. Once again, notice that the double bonded oxygen is always on the top. So aldose means that there's an aldehyde on the top. The double bond of the oxygen is at the end. And all the rest is filled in with OHs. Here, it's a ketone because it's not on the end, it's in the middle, but it's still furthest up. In other words, it's the top. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's hexose. And it's a ketone, so it's ketohexose. So we're going to decide if these are aldo or keto and how many carbons there are. Because the double bond is on top, this is an aldo. Since it's in the middle here, it's a keto. Now we have to decide how many carbons there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Their prefix is hex, so it's hexose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The prefix is pent, so it's pentose. So it's aldohexose and ketopentose. And there's the correct answers. That is the end of section 1, the introduction to carbohydrates.